on the state of things presently. For quite a while I have taken notice of a phrase that has been passed around the public ethos for what is probably the better part of the past century, perhaps further still. This phrase carries with it not only the normal or average amount of self-interpretation and individual definition that befalls much of our language, but an ever-changing, almost metaphysical understanding, or lack thereof, of the ideas encapsulated therein. Here, I am referring to the phrase, free market. Within the global community of freedom-minded individuals that I have come into contact with, the idea that if we could just get to a time where free markets were supreme, everything would return to normal seems omnipresent. The world economies would right themselves, and the entrepreneur, small businessman, craftsman, and laborer would be free to participate in unburdened trade and commerce. This train of thought has many passengers and makes multiple stops all over the world, each a little different from the other, but all following generally along the same track. The free market is often presented as the cure for the economic and political woes that much of the world currently suffers from. It has been repeated over and over again that laissez-faire, or let us be, is the most appropriate promoter of healthy commerce. And arguably, this is true. That the absence of restrictive interference, regulation, and government monopoly are going to make trade better for both producer and consumer seems obvious. But what seems to elude many who board this train of thought is the fact that government, which is the main institution that poses an obstacle to the free market train, is made up of individuals who, at least to some degree, believe themselves to have the right to limit and control not just the markets, but indeed everything within their foreseeable reach. With said government's reach only being limited by that of another government with equal or superior strength of arms and thus outside their realm of control. This somewhat elusive fact brings to light the reality in which we all find ourselves today. It goes without saying that if an institution, be it governmental, quasi-governmental, or even private, develops the ability and strength of arms to challenge the perceived authority of the aforementioned government that seeks to block or restrict access to that locomotive of free trade, and has the will to do so, then the aforementioned government's restrictions are made null and void. That being said, the world in which we live today is one that the government claims to have almost endless authority to do nearly anything it desires, and through the use of its arms does just that. Until, of course, that government is checked by another equally or more powerful government. This is something we all understand, if not explicitly, then implicitly through our day-to-day lives. Each day we come into contact with some form of coercive interaction with one or more representatives of government. The mere act of traveling is restricted, taxed, and monitored in cities and states that were once heralded as the bastions of liberty and freedom. Non-commercial activity has seemingly vanished from the lexicon of governmental representatives and employees. By simply existing as a citizen within the ever-expanding reach of governmental influence, you are participating in commerce and thus must be regulated, taxed, and monitored. The very act of growing and consuming one's own food is taken to be within the realm of their control and business. Endless tomes of laws and regulations are passed as fait accompli. Perplexing as it is, however, most living within the domain of this ever-growing construct still erroneously believe themselves to be operating within some form of a free market, granted their numbers are dwindling with growing rapidity. This does not, however, mean that many no longer wish to have actual free markets, and in fact, the more who realize that they boarded the wrong train and make their departure, the more there are who call for the creation of an actual free market. Nevertheless, here is where they diverge from reality. In their calls for the creation of a free market, many seem to forget, or rather are blinded by the gilt and sheen of the metaphorical free market train, that they do not, and in some cases cannot, see that such a thing cannot exist in a world where there are governments. They are antithetical concepts, and thus cannot cohabitate. I can hear many of the rebukes to this claim already. What about the 18th century? And what about the Industrial Revolution? What say you to the leaps and bounds made during the 19th and 20th centuries? And to these I reply, what about them? To think that during a time when empires and monarchies were still the most prevalent and powerful forms of government in the world, and that with their armies and navies the world's markets were free, is ingenuous at best and willfully ignorant at worst. To think that in the 19th century and even today there existed or exists somewhere a free market is equally as naive. Most if not all markets today, and in the past, are based in or rely on the use of money. Most if not all the world's major markets use money in the form of credit or paper. Most if not all of the world's major currencies and credit backings are fiat, or quite literally, government regulation or law. It stands to reason that there can be no such thing as a free market as long as there are governments which issue fiat currency, as the very act of its creation negates the ability of those using it to operate freely. But how does this negate one's ability to operate freely and without restriction, you might ask? If the currency is sound, it does not matter what stands back of it. As long as it is sound, then one's ability to operate freely is not restricted, might be your rebuttal. You would be right in your assumption that so long as the currency is sound, the liberty of the user is not restricted in its use. But when we use the word free, we do not imply that we wish to be free to do as we are told. Yet, this is what fiat currency is. It is the regulation of the market through the manipulation of the value of the major medium of exchange. If one can control the major medium of exchange, one can control the market. If the market can be controlled, it is not free. This can be countered through the invention and adoption of alternative currencies, shout those who espouse the use of such creative implements of free market mechanics. To this I need only point out that any and all such implements which begin to encroach or detract from the government's ability to regulate or control that which it deems it has the right to control, will be met with attacks and ultimately destruction, either through overt methods or covert tactics. All this being understood, what then can our current semi-independent markets do to counter the ever-growing monolith known as government? There have been several attempts from within our current semi-independent markets to address this problem. Multiple devices and technologies have risen and fallen into obscurity in vain attempts to challenge the illegalities of the actions of current governments. Cryptography, alternative media outlets, 3D printed firearms and firearm parts, and many others, none of which pose any real threat to the power of the state. Yes, some of these create thorns in the side of government, but none of them deliver the necessary destructive blow to render this behemoth reeling to its knees and ultimately to its death. Meanwhile, it grows ever stronger, ever more expansive and invasive, poisoning the water that we drink and bathe in with, at the very least, mind-numbing chemicals, genetically modifying the food that we eat so as to make us sterile and ill, polluting the air we breathe with untold numbers of things, most of which are detrimental to our health, openly tampering with and manipulating our weather so as to cause death and destruction on scales never before imagined, openly monitoring everyone's communications and actively entrapping those who are disgruntled with the way the government is functioning, not to mention assassinating any who would challenge its narrative and goals, torturing its own citizens as well as those of other governments, and every day printing more and more fiat currency, making each dollar's value go down, quietly draining any remaining wealth the citizens may have. All of this, and the only challenges from its citizens, take the forms of petitions, protests, marches, and empty threats directed at the ever-changing representatives of the construct named government. Gone are the days of direct action. Gone are the days of boycotting. Gone are the days of mobilizing picket lines and sit-ins. Now when the citizenry are angry, they beg, they plead, and they are beaten into submission. Moreover, the percentage of the population that is responsible for all this misery and drudgery that the multitudes are put through make up less than 10% of the population. In closing, the idea that we have a free market in a world prison is laughable when you stand far enough back. To say, simply because one can go to their local corner store and purchase 14 different brands of breakfast cereals, 6 different types of carbonated sugar water, and any number of different types of beer, that this stipulates access to a free market, is to state that one does not understand the meaning of free market. To say that we can have a free market while at the same time being enslaved by a government is likewise to miss the point of the expression. If we wish to be governed, we cannot be free. If we desire freedom, we must do away with government.